Russia's military operation against Ukraine continues unabated. What is evidently clear is that Russia will not halt its offensive until its goals are met, like what it calls denazifying and the demilitarization of Ukraine. Meanwhile, the West is pumping Ukraine with more arms, promoting fighting the Russian military machine. In this edition of The Spotlight, we will look at why the West is doing that and whether that approach will cost Ukrainians their country while the death toll continues to mount. Let me introduce our guest for this edition of The Spotlight. Don DeBar is a writer, radio host, and journalist who joins us from New York. Also joining us, Ian Williams. He is the president of the Foreign Press Association, who also joins us from New York. I'd like to welcome you both from New York, and I'll start first with you, Don DeBar. So what is Russia calling this? A campaign that is a special military operation is the phrase they used. It has said it has no plans to occupy Ukraine, and the Russian President Vladimir Putin says he wants a demilitarized, denazified, and neutral Ukraine. What do you think? Do you believe him? Or what do you think his intentions are?
Well, self-explanatory. Certainly Russia, the nation state in the world with the largest by far landmass, is not after a land grab. Certainly, the placement of U.S. Military forces along Russia's borders, the bellicose foreign policy towards Russia, for sure since 2015, 2016, when they were accused of meddling and stealing the election, and people like Jeanne Shaheen in the U.S. Senate were saying that their propaganda was an act of war with a body count, certainly have reason to be concerned with the abrogation of the the INF Treaty, Intermediate Range Missiles, and the Open Skies Treaty during the Trump administration, which was actually so benign compared to the previous administration that everyone was calling Trump Putin's puppet. They have some concerns about displacement of missiles that can make it to Moscow from Ukraine in 4 minutes, and a policy of placement of troops materiel that are clearly intended not only for an invasion, but actually begin almost at the furthest into the Soviet Union that Hitler achieved in the 40s with his invasion.
Very well. Ian Williams, I saw you shaking your head, but I'm going to ask you what your response to what Putin has said, additionally to what I asked on DeBar. He has said the move was undertaken, quote, to protect people who have been, quote, subjected to bullying and genocide, and that Russia will strive, and this is a quote, for the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. What is your view?
Every word is a lie, and some are too. Denazification. His own Wagner brigade of mercenaries have card-carrying Nazis in there. Denazification with a Jewish president? I mean, this man is frothing at the mouth. Let's get the facts straight. He invaded another country without provocation. They didn't invade him, he invaded them. He did so in violation of the United Nations Charter, which forbids the acquisition of territory by force and forbids armed action. He went to the Security Council, was defeated in the Security Council, and used an historical relic of a veto to do it. He went to the United Nations General Assembly and was resoundingly condemned there. He has now, remember, we're talking about protecting Russians. Kharkiv is a city that's mostly Russian-speaking. That's the one you've seen with bombs flying in there. Russian bombs hitting the Russian people.
Why is he doing that then? Why do you think he's doing that?
This is the epitome of destroying a village to protect it. This is about Putin's power. It's not about protecting.
Let's get a reaction from Don DeBar. Don DeBar, go ahead.
I don't want to waste time on hysterical laughter. And the president of Ukraine is actually a paid professional comedian for most of his career. And also on occasion, he's funny. I'm looking at the news reports today where Blinken announced that the United States is going to authorize, quote unquote, NATO countries to hand over, quote unquote, jet fighters to Ukraine. In other words, in essence, the U.S. is going to start conducting an aerial war over Ukraine because these planes are going to be backfilled by the United States, according to Blinken today, and you can't fly those planes without U.S. AWACS helping them to target and to locate the enemy planes. And so what we're talking about, while people are making up fantasies about what's going on, an actual, moving up close to an engagement between U.S. and Russian forces in the air over Ukraine.
Ian Williams,
now,
let me jump in. Hold on to your thoughts there. Ian Williams, well, what he's saying, what our guest there is saying, basically, U.S. is actively working on a plan to arm Ukraine more, and based on the most latest, as Don DeBar said, jets are going to come into. Why is the U.S. promoting this and other countries?
Pressure from the world.
Why
aren't they doing more? There are a lot of people who say they should actually threaten troops. Just let's consider, since we're doing all this whataboutery, why is it that Russian armed forces are fighting in Syria to keep a barbaric genocidal dictator in power at the invitation of the government? However, when it comes to Ukraine, the elected government asks for arms to defend itself against an actual full-scale military incursion by its neighbor.
Do you think Ukrainian army can withstand that?
Nothing at all. Let's look at those conscripts they're sending in. The interviews of them are pathetic. These poor kids have been dragged, they've been shoved into the army, they've been pushed across the border with no information. They've been told they're going to liberate. What do they see when they get there? They see civilians standing in front of the tanks.
Okay.
They see people in the houses that are being shelled and bombed from high altitude. This is just, it is.
All right, Ian Williams, hold on.
No way.
Let's get down to
any civilized human being can condone what Putin is doing, which is why even China wouldn't back him, because they know he's pushed the envelope.
That's a good question.
They
We're going to get to China. We're going to get to China a little later in the program. Don DeBar, go ahead.
First of all, I have to say that Biden reads his teleprompter better than he's reading the talking points here out of Langley. Almost every alleged statement of fact that you're making about conscripts, about all of this, complete fantasy. I'm talking to people that are on the ground there. They're telling me what they're seeing in front of them. They're telling me about Ukrainian soldiers putting their guns down and going to the camps of the Russians and having lunch with them. I'm hearing about and reading about also, even in Western press, about the Ukrainian army going in and taking out Azov battalion in Mariupol, because Azov battalion was preventing these civilians there from leaving the city on this guaranteed routes out that the Russians had provided. And so the actual Ukrainian
army... The one
army...
that they're shelling, that one, perhaps. That's what you're thinking, perhaps.
Okay, Ian Williams.
The guaranteed route out
let me ask you this, Ian Williams.
Yeah. It's okay. We know that one. It's well marked, the shell craters from the Russian army.
Ian Williams.
And you're evading the major point. The Russian army is in Ukraine. The Ukrainian army isn't in Russia. Who's invading whom? What special military operation is this? When the US went into Vietnam, they talked about pacification. They talked about destroying villages to save them.
Ukraine is currently an American colony.
All right.
To save.
We got to have one at a time speaking.
Kiev is being shelled.
Very well. Ian Williams, let me ask you this question, because I want to ask the same thing from Don DeBar. When you take a look at the Ukrainian army versus the Russian military, who is going to overpower the other? I mean, we're seeing arms flow into Ukraine in huge amounts, but we know what Russia's military is capable of. Based on your expert analysis, how do you think one measures up to the other?
I am an ethical analyst, not a military analyst. I think the Ukrainian army has done extremely well under the circumstances, because this was supposed to be a blitzkrieg.
But if you saw death toll mount, would you not want to stop the war?
A blitzkrieg in which Russian armor would go in and take Kiev. They have a column like a tapeworm stretched across Ukraine for 40 miles because it's run out of fuel. It's run out of food. It's being harassed by the locals. Its military equipment is being towed away by peasants with tractors. It's pathetic. But they've got a lot of troops. They have a lot of hardware and military equipment. And, the odds are on the Russians. But then they have to occupy a country where it is quite clear that they are detested and reviled.
So let me ask Don DeBar.
Even the Russian speakers
what he thinks.
are
Don DeBar.
Sorry,
Ian Williams. Don DeBar, when you take a look... Thank you, Ian Williams. Don DeBar, when you take a look at the Russian military versus the Ukrainian military, one analyst has said that Russia is using 5% of its capabilities. When you take a look at Russia's military, in your perspective, if it is superior or has far more capabilities than the Ukrainian military, wouldn't logic dictate that the president of that country should stop the civilian death toll of mounting and therefore put a stop to this, which is what President Putin has said, regardless of whether Putin is right or wrong?
I mean, the short answer is yes. First of all, you have a few difficulties, however, because Zelensky has been in Warsaw since last weekend. He's not even in Ukraine. He fled first to Lvov, or Lviv, depending on your preference, with the NATO HQ in Ukraine and the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine a week ago. And I don't know if he was in a suitcase for protection with them or on a leash, like a monkey on with an organ grinder. But they fled by Monday, I believe. They started having press conferences with NATO's people from Ukraine in Warsaw. This was, by the way, while last weekend,
had one.
They were
so
talking
you're ignoring
about
all the pictures of him in the center there. You're all ignoring all the pictures. Compare Putin. He's at the end of a table. He's at the opposite side of a football stadium from his own cabinet.
Well, Ian Williams, let Don DeBar finish. Ian Williams, I'm sorry.
He's such a paranoid,
okay.
crazy person.
Very
he
well.
Does not trust
Don
his
DeBar,
own
go ahead.
advisors.
Ian Williams, I'm sorry. I'm going to come to you in a second. Don DeBar, go ahead.
So I wanted to finish. So at last weekend, when they were trying to negotiate for this past Monday's talks between Ukraine and Russia, Zelensky was insisting that they meet in Warsaw, despite the fact that Russia was saying, let's meet in Ukraine near the Belarus border. And the reason they didn't want to was because he was already in Warsaw. He fled the country while he has people conscripting 16-year-old boys. Okay, he's in Warsaw at the with NATO HQ and the U.S.
He's in Ukraine, and
First,
why would you
Ukraine
go
is
close to
not
the Russian border
an
when you've got a
independent
bunch of murderous psychopaths, including a president who kills his own opponents with poisoned darts, who poisons people on his own territory, who goes into Britain to poison, and he's supposed to get close to this?
Let's talk about the UK.
I mean,
okay, the empire that never set, the sun never set on, with the millions of bodies around
All right,
the world.
if you both speak at the same time, we're not going to understand what you're saying, and I'm the third person. So let's stop that. Let's look at the assertive Putin that Ian Williams is against, obviously, what he's doing. Don DeBar, I need to bring this side of Putin in the picture, but then get your analysis. So Ian Williams, Ukraine could cease to exist. That is what the Russian President Vladimir Putin has said in a warning. If leaders continue to do what they are doing, saying that countries imposing a no-fly zone will be considered combatants. So Putin is issuing his warnings. Why is he talking in that level?
Remember, he has threatened the use of nuclear weapons. He is now a self-confessed war criminal.
My question is,
the nuclear option.
Why is he so assertive? Why is he portraying?
Not even Kim Jong-il has threatened the nuclear option. Putin has. That means.
Why has he done that? Why has he done that?
More to the point is he is saying, I am going to wipe out a sovereign country.
But why? Why would he say that?
The UN treaty, in defiance of its own people, regardless.
Okay.
So when you look at Zelensky, is he Churchill or is he Stalin?
Okay.
Stalin could have surrendered in
Don DeBar.
1941 and saved lots of Russian lives, but he said not one step backwards.
All right. Thank you, Ian Williams. Let me get Don DeBar in. Let me get Don DeBar in. Ian Williams. Please.
These people are remembered with some reference and reverence because they stood up against evil aggressors. Putin is an evil aggressor. Zelensky is standing up against him.
Thank you.
Amazingly so, by the way.
All right, Ian Williams. Don DeBar, same question to you. Why is Putin coming out off so assertive and so extreme, in a sense, in terms of the warnings that he's issuing against Ukraine?
He said so himself. There's a knife at our throat. That's what he was talking about for Russia. The United States has been moving NATO forces, military forces, to Russia's border on a steady march since 1989, really, when Germany was reunified. Despite promises and assurances, forget all that. Grown-ups don't believe what each other say, even with contracts. That's why they have courts and appellate courts and such. And that's why there are wars, too, by the way, because people breach agreements. But the United States has moved its military up to Russia's borders and been pounding on its chest and training the people of the United States to tolerate a war, in essence, and lying about how much they'll tolerate, like Reuters just did. Reuters said in a report on Friday that a poll that they had conducted this past week showed that 74% of Americans would tolerate or accept the need for a no-fly zone over Ukraine. That if you actually go dig, because they had no links to any of the stories either on their own website or what was sent out, but go into their own polling company's website and find the questionnaire, that question was never on there. And the only two closely related ones were 2-1 against. No troops to go there and no aerial bombing of Ukraine on behalf of Ukraine's government.
Okay.
So he knows what's going on.
Polls, 90%
So let's
of
get down to
Ukrainians now support their president.
In
It
Williams.
was much lower before. Putin has achieved Finland in NATO, Sweden in NATO. He'll probably get Switzerland in NATO.
I read that in the paper
He's
today,
achieved
too.
an increase in military spending in all the countries of NATO, including Germany, which was thoroughly agnostic about this before. He has scored a spectacular geopolitical own goal.
Very well.
Okay.
Let me move on to this issue. This is a topic that we don't talk about. Ian
by the time
Williams.
he's finished selling reactors and dropping bombs on them.
Ian Williams.
But he will have lost.
This is a topic that's not talked about much. From what Putin has said, people may be dismissing it, but Putin has said about these nationalists, and I need for you to give us what your impression or understanding of it is. He says nationalists are using civilians as human shields. He said that at a press conference. He said this to the Turkish president also, in the context where he said actions of the nationalists, which he called the neo-Nazi units, look particularly cruel and cynical. They continue intensive shelling of Donbass and use civilians, including foreigners, who are basically taken hostage as human shields in Ukrainian cities and towns. Do you believe him? Is that what's happening?
No.
Okay.
I think he's
Don
lying.
DeBar, what do you think?
It's obvious that that's what's happening. That's what's happening right now in Mariupol. The Ukrainian army thinks that that's what's happening, and that's why they killed 20 Azov members in their headquarters.
Ian Williams, you heard our guest.
I haven't heard that report, but if it's true, it contradicts what he's saying. It means the Ukrainian government is taking action against
Azov,
a militant militia
against
there.
troops.
So they are taking action against the people perpetrating these crimes. On the other hand, it is definitely true that there's a couple of 100,000 Russian troops inside Ukraine, unwanted by the people, shooting at civilians who are demonstrating on the streets against them, who are standing in front of tanks and military equipment rolling.
Said that. You've said that.
Who do you see on this? You can see it plainly. This is an armed aggression against the people who are now united.
You've made that stance very clear.
Ukraine will
Don
never
DeBar,
ever unite with
thank
Russia.
you.
I thought Ukraine and Russia shouldn't have split myself, but they did. And they did so partly because of Russian arrogance and Yeltsin and American support on it. However, they have now split, and it's no more. It's less likely that Ireland will reunite with England than that Ukraine will reunite with Russia.
Let's move on.
Putin's
We
big
just have a few
achievement.
minutes left. I'm sorry. Don DeBar, plain and simple here, a question that I want to ask you. What is the role of the U.S. here? What is it doing? We know it's providing arms and encouraging other nations to do that, but what is it instructing Ukraine to do here?
First, let's start with a telephone call made on February 4th, 2014, between Jeff Pyatt, who was the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine's elected government at that time, and Victoria Nuland, who was the U.S. Undersecretary of State for European Affairs, where they selected the people who were going to become the government on February 25th, 2014. Those people, in turn, set up an election for Poroshenko to become president, who was really the guy behind their grouping. This is after $5 billion of U.S. money was spent setting up the preconditions for this to happen. That government has been a satrap, a colony of the United States, since it was placed in power in February of 2014. And the first thing that government did when it took power was declare war on the eastern part of the country and begin shelling it.
The one that was occupied by the Russian troops. I remember it well.
The body count is 14,000 Ukrainians thus far, 80% of them in the east.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Ian Williams, same question to you, but the blame I'm going to talk about here and ask you is that Russia wants to replace the current government, and it's after what some have called regime change. At the same time, there are news that's seeping out. It's not verified, but it's indicating that the U.S. is also looking at the next government that should be there in Ukraine, in a sense, drawing the conclusion that it wants to beat Russia to the punch, I guess. What do you think is happening here?
The indications are, as I remember, that American officials said that the president of Ukraine and his government have set in place succession plans for if they are killed by the invading Russians. Now, that is a complete reversal of what you're talking about.
Sure.
They're setting up succession plans, just like the president and the vice president and all the rest of it. They will still have a functioning government so that Putin can't foist in his own government to negotiate with. The one thing, I repeat, once again, it's clear, and even the Russians aren't claiming it, is that Russia has very little constituency in Ukraine, that they will never get popular support, that they will have to forcibly impose an occupation, a quisling government, if they come in, that government will then have no credibility at all. So it really is a busted flush. And everything else, it really is sort of nostalgia for the good old days of the Comintern and the Soviet Union, who we will always support because they're on the far side of progress. The U.S. is a busted flush in many ways.
I got one final question.
It's right. And I come from Britain, where the Americans were evil, double-dealing, but they did come to our aid in 1941.
Very well. Last question here. I have to ask Don DeBar. I'm sorry. Putin has revealed the conditions for a ceasefire, Don DeBar, but it's nothing new. Kiev must cease fighting and fulfill Moscow's demands in order for this Russian military operation to stop against Ukraine. Of course, we know what those promises are. And Russia is not coming short on that. So what are we looking at here? Is that going to happen, or are we still looking at Russia continuing its offensive until it obtains its goals?
Well, first, coming back to earth to describe the situation on the ground in Ukraine, the eastern half of the country not only welcomed the Russian military in, but in fact, they've been crying for them for the last 8 years. One of the pressures on Putin, in fact, was the fact that the Duma, 2 weeks prior to the beginning of this operation,
was that the Duma he appointed, where if anyone speaks against it, get waltzed up by the police?
Yeah, sure. Just like the parliament in Britain. Let me finish my statement, please.
Go ahead,
they almost unanimously called on him to recognize those two republics. The reason are that they're people that have families in both places, and there's domestic political pressure across Russia for him to protect those people, and it was demanded by the people that live there.
I'm sorry.
When the troops arrived in the eastern part of the
Don
country,
DeBar, I'm really sorry. I have to jump in. Unfortunately, we're just fresh out of time. I do apologize. Thank you for both of you. Don DeBar, thank you. Writer, radio host, and journalist from New York, and also from New York, Ian Williams. Thank you for your input. Writer, radio host, president of the Foreign Press Association, USA. And with that, we come to an end for this edition of The Spotlight. From Kaveh, and the team is goodbye until next time.